If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what's the creepiest, scariest supernatural thing you've ever seen or encountered? When I was 11, I woke up in the middle of the night to find my bedroom light on. I was confused and looked over to the stairs and thought I saw my little sister's head kind of peeking out, like she was hiding and waiting for me to see her prank of turning on my light. I called out, "Very funny, I can see you," and my voice sounded so loud in the silent house. I realized her head was part of the banister, and it wasn't her. And I realized she was likely sound asleep in her own bed, and I was all alone. I'm sure I must have walked over, turned on the light, and woken up later. But it was so unsettling to think something silly was happening only to realize I was alone. The house was totally quiet, and everyone else was asleep and didn't know what was happening. I was 19 years old at the time. I had just finished boot camp and then infantry school. I was only in my actual unit for 2 months before hitting Iraq. When we started the Battle of Fallujah back in 2004, almost no one in my company had actual combat experience, and I sure as hell didn't. Well, after my first day of actual combat, obviously very hopped up and nervous, I got put on watch from midnight to 4. It was the city's recreation center, I believe, that we had holed up in, so it had 4 to 6, my memory is fuzzy, glass doors. I was in a little broom closet with a radio, all by myself, watching these doors to make sure no one snuck in and killed us all while we slept. Every single noise, distant gunshot, or anything else would freak me out. Then there were a million stray cats and dogs, so I'd hear this soft pit-pat approaching the door and see a shadow move towards it. My adrenaline would spike, and I'd just sit there, aiming my rifle, and wait. It was easily the creepiest time of my life. Me and my best friend were dating a couple of girls, who were also best friends, in a very small Midwestern town out in the middle of nowhere. My friend and I were from the city, about 40 miles away. We were all together at my girlfriend's house late at night when she got really upset about something, I don't remember what now, something minor, it was 20 years ago, and ran out of the house. I asked her friend A if she was coming back. She said, "I don't know." I thought I should go after her, and I said, "Well, where do you think she went?" A said, "Probably to the cemetery, she usually goes to her sister's grave when she gets like this." Did I mention that she was a little crazy? Okay, very crazy. So I decide to be a good boyfriend and go walking to the cemetery at the edge of town at 3 a.m. I'd never been there before, and it was in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but cornfields around it. That was already on the extreme side of my creepy scale. Anyway, I spent at least a half an hour wandering around it looking for her. It was very large for such a small town and had some really odd monuments. One that stuck out was a beheaded angel holding its head in its hands. Extreme creepy plus 10. After wandering around all that time and thinking I would be attacked by zombies at any moment and not seeing any sign of my girlfriend, I figured she had already been devoured. I see 2 shadows walking towards me. Fortunately, it was my friend and his girlfriend. It turned out my girlfriend had just walked around the block and come home, and I had spent all that time walking around alone. Not something I would ever do voluntarily. Here's the kicker, when I told A about the headless angel, she got really excited. "You saw it? Really? Not too many people have seen it. You're really lucky." I asked her what she meant by that. She said, "It's not real. Lots of people in town have seen it, but there isn't a statue like that there." I've always considered myself a skeptic, so the next morning I drove out there and went through the entire grounds. She was right, it didn't exist. It was nowhere to be found. I had never heard the story before that night, and later I met other people in town who had also seen it. To this day, I have no explanation for it. I'm Irish and was still living in Tyrone, Ireland, when this happened. About 4 years ago, I was lying in my bed in my parents' house. My bed was right next to the window, when I was woken up by a horrible screaming and wailing noise in our back garden at 3 a.m. It was like the noise a terribly injured cat would make, but crossed with the noise of a screaming baby. I opened the window and looked out, and I heard the noise again, but this time coming from the back garden of the house next door, then one more time from the third house, and then it stopped. Something about it completely terrified me, and I knew something wasn't right about it, but I tried to convince myself it was a cat that had been hit by a car and had crawled off into the many hedges and bushes behind our houses to die. I went downstairs to go outside and see if I could find it, and my own cat was lying fast asleep. If he had heard it too, he would have been at the window looking out. It was then that I realized I had only heard it. Freaked out, I went back to bed. The next morning, I was talking to my mom at breakfast and asked if she'd heard the noise. She said, "No, but did you hear the terrible news?" The man who lives in the house 2 doors down dropped dead at 3 a.m. last night. You must have heard the banshee. Phew, that was some scary shit. I know a lot of people think the whole fairies thing in Ireland is just made up for tourists, but actually, pretty much everyone here has seen or heard SHT like this or knows other people who have. Most families have a story about hearing the banshee before someone dies. It was the most horrible noise I ever heard, and I sincerely hope I never hear it again. It wasn't a fox or a cat. Our house has a lot of foxes around it, they screech pretty much constantly, and this sounded totally different. Through college, I developed a love of ultralight backpacking. My friends and I were too poor to afford a proper vacation, but we were in school in the Appalachian Mountains, so we just took what we needed and went for a hike several times a year. Later, when I was trying to impress my fiancée's family, I agreed to go prospecting with her father. He was seriously into the shit dredges, high bankers, slept in a tent in the woods, and they sucked gold out of creek beds. This is my hobby, and since it involved camping, I figured it would be fun. So we're camping in the middle of nowhere, NC. They were in their tent, and I was in my hammock with a rain fly over my head. No fire, just me and the bugs, the way I usually like it. They had left their dog out, though, and every once in a while he would wake me up rummaging around camp. He was even sniffing at my head through the hammock, basically annoying the snot out of me. The next morning, I told them what a pain in the ass Pootie had been. Their reply? Pootie was in the tent with us all night. Are you sure it was a dog? Sure enough, there are bear tracks all over camp. And they've seen a black bear with 2 cubs around there and didn't bother to warn me about it. I spent the next 2 nights in the mother ducking tent, with a mother ducking gun. I had a dream once about one of those first-person shindigs. Now I should point out that I very rarely lucid dream, maybe once or twice in my life, so I'm not very aware in my dreams that something isn't real. Hell, I've dreamt about having a beer with myself and not picked up any signs that might be a dream. Anyway, whoever's eyes I was looking through, I like to think it was John Malkovich's eyes. He was walking up my drive, and I could see my house. He approached the kitchen window, and I saw that it was open, as was he. He jimmied it open a bit further and pulled himself into my house. Standing in my kitchen, everything is quiet. I can faintly hear the pipes creaking. But he doesn't stand still for long, he sets off out of the kitchen and into the hallway. I walked right past my dad's office, ignoring any computers, phones, or anything else that might be worth stealing. He walks to the bottom of the stairs. To his right is my sitting room, the room that has the most SHT worth stealing after my dad's office. But that's of no interest to him either, I'm just staring up the stairs. At a slow pace, with feet on either side of the steps to avoid making much noise, he begins to walk up the stairs. Now at the top of the stairs, you have a spare bedroom to your right, a bathroom right in front of you, and my bedroom to the left. About halfway up the stairs, I could see my bedroom door. A pang of fear ran through me as I could see that I had left my door ajar and that the glow from my computer would surely attract his attention. My eyes are fixed on my door now. He eventually reached the top of the stairs. Then, much like he did with the previous rooms, he completely ignores the spare room and the bathroom. I don't even look at them. I see his hand reach out as he presses against my door, and it swings open. Now I'm looking at myself. I can see myself sleeping, illuminated by the aforementioned computer that's whirring away in the corner. I don't look at the computer, I don't look at the GameCube, this was a while ago, and I don't look at any of the countless items he could pocket and leave with. I'm just looking at myself. He approaches me and leans over my sleeping body. There, he stops. And stands. And I stare. Then I woke up. And by that, I mean I actually wake up. This is no dream within a dream. My eyes open, I'm scared, and I'm looking at a man with a baseball cap who is leaning over my bed and peering at me. I can't move, but, thankfully neither can he. I force myself to breathe, and after what feels like an endless amount of time, I find the courage to put my hand out. As my hand enters the space that he's occupying, it travels through him, and his image fades away, like dust caught on the wind, in this deadly still room. My boyfriend's friend told me about something that happened to her about 5 years ago. She was driving with her friend to San Francisco from LA and was on the 5 motorway, about 2 hours out of SF, at AM. If you've never driven here, this is the area where there is nothing. You feel like you are in the damn middle of nowhere, and driving there at the right time, like 3 AM, can put you in complete solitude since it's too early for people to be driving in and out to work, travel, etc. They admit to being young and stupid at the time. They were both 17 when it happened, and they would drive up next to people that had hazard lights on as if they were going to help them, then they would drive away. Or they would drive through puddles. It was raining, and splash people. They're driving pretty fast and catch up to a car very quickly, which turns out to actually be stopped in the very middle lane of the motorway with its regular lights on but not hazard lights. So they slow down and keep driving at what she says was a steady 35 since she was looking back. Then a tall man gets out of the car and gets on the ground. So she keeps driving because, all of a sudden, they both feel extremely scared. He starts running on all fours, like he's galloping, after them. She says they screamed and sped up and started driving 40, then 50, and looked back, and he was catching up with them. Her friend starts crying and starts trying to decide if she should call the police, but she doesn't, considering how far out they were. She ducking punches it and starts approaching 70 miles an hour, with this galloping man about 100 feet behind them. He gets closer, probably about half that, the friend says, as she was staring, not having to pay attention to the road. She starts crying too and thinking they are both going to get killed, so she hits about 80 miles and the man stops in his tracks and stands up and stares, and she says for a split second, even from 80 to 100 feet away and only with the light emitting from her rear lights in the darkness, she looks in the rearview mirror at him and they lock eyes and feel nothing like she has ever felt before. As she was telling me this, the hair on her arm stood up. She thinks he was possessed. They didn't see him again, but that freaks me out. There was this massive area of woods near my parents' old house in the boondocks, right on the edge of hick territory. There was a giant field in the center that you had to go through a tunnel of woods to get to. So one night a few buddies and I did some blowing, and I decided in my infinite wisdom we should go hang out in the field at like midnight. We start walking through the tree tunnel, about 4 of us, when all of a sudden we hear a group of footsteps walking in the trees to our right. We all kind of give each other looks and eventually stop walking. The footsteps stop, and we confirm with each other what we heard. We're freaked out, but we start walking again. The footsteps begin again. We stop walking again, more suddenly this time. The other footsteps stop, but not as fast. We hear a few crunches after we all stop walking. We're all tweaked out, so none of us can be sure we're not just imagining things, but after repeating this a few times, it becomes absolutely certain that something is following us, and it sounds bipedal. We're too far into the woods now, all coked up, to start talking loudly about how we'll duck up anything that comes near us. Eventually we make it out to the field, and we hang out in the middle, where we have a clear view of anything trying to come up on us. We're there for 2 or 3 hours until we decide it might be safe to head back. We start walking down the trail again back to our car, and not a fourth of the way through, the footsteps begin again. Same side of the woods, still stopping and starting when we do except when we fake them out, but at this point we just want to get to the car as fast as we can. The footsteps follow us until we're about 10 feet away from the car. We get in and get the duck out of there. I haven't been back since. As a child, we lived on a remote farm where a lot of unexplained phenomena occurred. Animals would be found ritually slaughtered, and the barn would glow at night an eerie blood red. The scariest was the flying girl. My brothers and I were walking through a field on a summer day. We noticed in the next field a young girl, maybe 8 or 9, clawing at her legs. We stopped and stared, and she caught sight of us. Immediately she rose up about 3 feet in the air and flew, screaming towards us, but disappeared about 3 yards from us. We ran home and told my parents, who knowingly nodded. It was years later that we found out the farm had been built on the scene of a terrible Highland battle where many hundreds of Scottish clansmen had been slaughtered. When I was younger, I went on a camping trip. The tents we were staying in were quite spacious, and you could easily stand up in them. So I was sleeping on a military cot when, all of a sudden, I woke up for no apparent reason. There was a kid wearing tights standing up in my tent, staring straight forward. I don't know what to do, so I say, "Hey, what are you doing?" in a whispered tone. He doesn't move or say a word, so I attempt to touch his hand to make him aware that he is in the middle of my tent in his ducking underwear. Well, my hand goes right mother ducking through this dude's hand. I actually pinched myself to make sure I wasn't dreaming. After about 30 seconds, he walks out of the tent, and his footsteps don't make a sound. Duck that shit. I was riding some ATV trails with my uncle, and the family dog was running along, following us. It was a beautiful, sunny summer day in northern Wisconsin. As we went deeper into the woods, my uncle was speeding up, getting the dog excited and running faster. Both of them started to disappear from sight as the gap got bigger. Around this same time, I started to notice how unusually quiet the forest had become. For some reason, I slowed to a stop and looked around. The area had become dark, devoid of life and sound. The trees were all bare, sickly, and twisted. I had an extremely difficult time trying to process my surroundings when my hair stood up. I made eye contact with some kind of dog-like creature watching me from behind a tree. It was sick, with hair missing, massive yellow eyes, and long, slender fingers clutching the tree next to it for support. It stood around 6 feet tall and just watched me. This moment felt like eternity until suddenly the back of my neck became warm, and I turned to see the sun seemingly appear from nowhere. I then spun my head back around to face the creature and was met by a beautiful, green, healthy forest. Birds chirping, wind nudging the leaves and grass. My surroundings had died and become reborn in a matter of seconds. Within moments, my uncle came back down the trail and said, "We need to go home." I am unsure what he saw exactly, but both of us knew it was time to leave. We haven't been down that trail since that day almost 10 years ago, and I still find myself wondering exactly what happened. In all of my time spent outdoors, I have never had a similar experience. When I was around 15 years old, I was sitting in the kitchen eating dinner. Our kitchen connects with the living room through a huge arch-like opening. The lights were on, and as I was eating, with my peripheral vision, I could see the living room and stairs to the second floor. At that moment I saw some sort of orb emitting bright light coming downstairs. It immediately caught my attention, and I turned to the stairs. There was nothing, so I kept eating and didn't think of anything. Yet a few minutes later I saw the same thing, but now moving across the living room towards the kitchen. Note, my mom was also in the kitchen near the stove. So now I'm getting a bit weird vibes. I told my mother that I'm seeing things moving in the living room. She laughed that off. Nothing serious, and once again I saw it in that arch opening hovering. I told it to Mom. She just stopped turning and said that she with her peripheral vision saw the same thing. So we freaked out a bit, but somehow we didn't feel any threat from that thing. That evening, both of us saw it again moving around the house. I grew up in an old farmhouse. It was around 150 years old, it must be around 175 now, and located in a sparsely populated area in north-central Iowa. Very rural. There were a lot of odd occurrences over the years my family lived there, but the most frightening one for me occurred when I was a teenager. I was old enough to be home alone but not old enough to drive. My parents and older sister were all out for the night, so it was just me and the dogs at home. I settled in to watch a movie in the living room located on the first floor of the house when I heard someone walking heavily in the hallway above me. This house had plank wood flooring with nothing remotely sound insulating. These steps were distinct, heavy, and unmistakable. I knew I was the only person home, and the house was miles from the closest neighbor, let alone town. My stomach was in a knot, but I tried to be logical and quickly decided it must be a dog, even though the steps sounded much too heavy for our small terriers. I leaned forward in the recliner to call for them, but as I leaned forward, I saw that both dogs were already sitting at my feet. And they looked terrified. I took the dogs and the wireless house phone, ran out of the house, and locked myself in my mom's car in the driveway. I called my parents and waited in the car for them to get home. They had both had enough experience in the house to not doubt me. Another story from that house: the family who built the house lived out their lives there, including their daughter. Her name was Minnie, and she never married and thus lived in the house her entire life, from birth to death. A few years after my parents moved, I was talking to my mom about all the odd incidents that happened in that house. She asked me if I ever found little gold safety pins around the house. I hadn't. She then shared that she was always finding little gold safety pins when she was alone in the house. Multiple times, she had even had them drop onto her, landing in her book or on her sewing project. She would look up and even check for cracks in the ceiling, but they seemed to fall from nowhere. It made her uneasy, but it mostly just perplexed her. Then my grandma told my mom that she had once met Minnie years ago. My grandma was an RN at the local hospital, and when she was a young nurse, Minnie came into the ER. She was very old at this point and in poor health. In order to treat her, the nurses had to undress her, as she was wearing layers and layers of clothes. My grandma said it was an incredibly frustrating task because all of her layers of clothes were fastened together with hundreds upon hundreds of tiny gold safety pins. As a kid, maybe 12, I walked into my mom's room to kiss her goodnight. I didn't realize she was asleep, and as I entered, I woke her. She saw me standing in the doorway and jumped straight out of bed. She grabbed me, threw me on the bed, and tried to choke me out while kind of clawing at my face. I grabbed a pillow to try to put it between us, but she was on top of me and screaming. I remember seeing her face in the light coming from the hallway, and she was crazed. I kept screaming at her, "It's me! It's me!" But she wouldn't stop. Somehow I got out from under her, and I ran out into the lounge room, where my dad was standing up, about to see what was going on. I grabbed him and threw him between me and my mom, who was right behind me and still clawing at my face. He grabbed her and bear hugged her while her arms reached out over his shoulders, still clawing at me. I don't know how, but she woke up and immediately started crying, really sobbing, and apologizing. She said she was stuck in some sort of not quite asleep, not quite awake state, and when I stood in the doorway, all she could see was that I was wearing her face, and she felt she had to get it off me. We stayed up all night crying, and I still won't walk into a room if someone is asleep. When I was maybe 15 years old, I used to drink a lot, and every time I got drunk, some time or another, I would see this black shadow with yellow glowing eyes. The first incident was when I was walking back to my house after drinking up in the hills, which is like a mile or just under a mile from my house with friends. I was walking. I only have a strong buzz, and this road I get on is about a 600-yard stretch to my house. I was walking down it, and I was looking at houses until I looked out into the field behind them and saw it. I didn't believe my eyes at first and continued walking. I got to my house and looked behind it, and it was still there, just looking at me. I didn't think much of it. In my most recent incident, I was drinking with my brother and his fiancée. I decided, well, I'm going to go to sleep, and the dog followed me and laid down below my bed. As I was lying there, I closed my eyes for about an hour, and I woke up. Maybe 15 to 20 minutes later, the dog was whimpering, and I sat up and looked down around her. Then I looked over into my closet, and it was in there. Glowing yellow eyes, just looking at me. I sat up and asked what it wanted and why it had been following me. It just went behind my closet door, it has 2 sliding doors, and disappeared. Now, I have seen this thing well over 100 times as I am an alcoholic and 24 now. My brother's fiancée has seen it twice, and she was sober. My brother saw it once by accident, actually from peeking in my room as I was passed out. So I know this isn't something I'm imagining, but this thing is getting less and less scary and more like a friend, which is weird. I've mentioned this thing to my parents, brothers, and friends. My father thinks it's an evil spirit. My brothers think it's just bothering me until I do what it wants, which I don't know. My mom thinks it's just looking out for me. My friends think that I need to go to a ceremonial Native American thing to wash away evil. I'm Native American. When I was younger, my sister's boyfriend asked me to walk to the store with him because he didn't want to walk alone to it at night, and my sister was already sleeping, and he didn't want to wake her because she's moody like that. I agreed because he said he would buy me snacks. When we were walking home, the street lights above us began to turn off as we passed them. When I looked behind us, I was met with total darkness. Looking into the dark has always unnerved me, but for some reason I felt genuine fear when I gazed into it this time. My sister's boyfriend probably felt the same way, because he picked me up and began to rush us home. The way he held me had me looking behind us, and because I felt so scared looking behind us, I just closed my eyes till we got home. When we got home, we both just kind of looked at each other. I said, "Thank you for the snacks," and went off to my room. For the rest of the night, I kept wondering if I saw anything in the shadows, but I didn't. I hoped whatever was in there, though, didn't follow us home. I was living with my stepdad outside of Houston, Texas, sort of my whole family, and I was dating this girl who lived in this sort of trailer park thing outside of the neighborhood. Between my neighborhood and her neighborhood, there was this wooded area. It was actually wooded on either side of the entrance to the neighborhood that we lived in. So the girl I was dating was addicted to prescription painkillers and would usually get them from her mom, who was a recovering addict, sort of. She really just traded one addiction for another, but that's, not really important. I had a bike, and she asked me to bike to where her mom was staying with her stepdad around midnight. I called her mom to let her know that I was coming to get some pills for her. She knew it was something I was uncomfortable with, but I didn't feel like I had a choice because it was an abusive relationship. Well, as I'm biking there, which is only about a 20-minute bike altogether, I start smelling the smell that smells like rotting meat, decay, or garbage. And I just could feel this sort of heavy oppressive presence. I got to the trailer park and to the specific trailer that her stepdad had, and I let them know I was there. Her mom gave me the pills and some snacks for my ex, and I was biking back. Once I got to the stretch of road where the wooded area ran adjacent to it, I heard this loud sort of scream that sounded like a mixture of anguish and reach, and it didn't really sound human to me. I started biking faster, and I could hear the sound of heavy breathing and running in the wood line to the right of me in the wooded area. I got to the entrance of the neighborhood and was under a street light when I sort of heard the movement stop. I looked, and I could see a pair of eyes staring at me from the darkness. Knowing what the area looked like during the day, it had to be about 7 or 8 feet tall. I told my then girlfriend about it, and she believed me, but when I told my mother about it, she told me I had an active imagination. The reason why I think it was Bigfoot is because the following day I was biking to the gas station, which was a little further from my house than my ex's stepdad's trailer, and I stopped to tie my shoes at the entrance on the other side of where I'd been chased. So if you're leaving the neighborhood, the gas station and the wooded area where I was chased would be to the left. I stopped on the right-hand side, and I saw these two figures walking through the woods that were tall and hairy, and they were walking like a couple, like one's arm was around the other sort of near the small of the back. When I looked up and grabbed my bike, I guess they heard me because they both turned around at the same time, and the one that was holding the other pulled it closer and urged it to keep moving, and then they both turned around to walk further into the woods. About a year ago, I went camping with two of my friends, let's call them Mike and Hike. We leave my house with all the equipment and head towards the woods at about 3 p.m. It is usually good to leave early in the morning so as not to find yourself without light to set up the camp, but we were busy in the morning, so we decided to leave anyway. We arrive in the woods with the car, we look for a clearing where to plant the tents and make a fire, we find it, we hide the car, you never know, better not to be too noticed from the main road, and we start unloading stuff from it. We are a little behind on the schedule, and the sun begins to set. We unloaded the car, pitched the tents, and set things up in the food tent, and we are chopping wood for the fire. As soon as it gets pitch dark, we decide to take the headlamps, light the fire, and have dinner. Mike and Hike are outside the tent talking about something, and I am inside searching for my lamp. I stop moving to make less noise and listen to them because they have a strange tone of voice, but suddenly they stop talking, and Hike reaches into the tent, takes his backpack without looking, and takes out his blanking gun. I immediately go out to find out what the duck is going on. Mike and Hike are 5 feet from the tent. Mike is holding his knife, and Hike is holding the gun. They are looking into the dark, and Mike says, "Are you seeing this?" At first, I don't see anything, but then Hike, moving the flashlight, aims it better. There is the reflection of two eyes, like 15 feet from us and a few centimeters from the ground, that are looking at us. I also take out the knife, and we stand still, staring at it. Mike says it's probably a boar that smelled the food. Hike says, "If it moves towards us, I'll shoot, I don't give a shite." Me, what do we do if he doesn't get scared by the shots? Boars are brave animals, they often charge at you even if you have fired a real bullet at them. Mike, if it's a boar, we don't have to run away, it's faster and can charge us from behind. The best thing right now would have been to fire a couple of shots in the air to try to scare him anyway, but that would have meant that we would have to take everything apart and leave because going camping in our state is partially illegal, so it would have drawn too much attention to us. We stood and talked for what felt like 20 minutes, and eventually the eyes disappeared into the darkness. After this, we lit the fire, took out the big flashlights from the backpacks, and started lighting the surrounding area to make sure that whatever it was gone. We had dinner and drank a lot afterwards. We didn't see them again in the following days. Thinking about it continues to give me the chills, also because there is no way it was a boar. Boars are loud, you hear them grunt, and we heard a few the following days. The only animals that are in that area are wild boars, badgers, weasels, and wolves, and none of them perfectly match what we have seen. I'm not saying there's something paranormal, but not knowing what it was for sure makes me restless. My favorite story my mom has told me is about my father, who died when I was 1. We have a family farm, just a piece of property in the middle of nowhere that my grandparents bought in the 1960s. No animals, but a big chunk of land and a nice farmhouse. We always celebrate holidays out there and have made our best memories on that land. 2 months after my dad passed away, everyone went out to celebrate Labor Day. It was about 3 a.m., and the only people left by the bonfire were my mom, her cousin, and his wife. They heard a car coming down the road, which was odd, they were in the middle of nowhere. They waved to the truck and thought maybe they were just going down to the creek. The three of them head up to the fence line to make sure there's no funny business going on and hear footsteps coming up the gravel road. My mom signals for the other two to come to her in case the guy tries to pull anything. The man is in jeans, cowboy boots, and a cowboy hat. He comes up to the fence line and removes his hat. It is my father. My mother immediately screams and goes white as a ghost. My other cousin witnessed him tip his hat and disappear into the darkness. They all ran down the dead-end dirt road to try to find the truck, but there was no sign of anyone or anything going down that road. When I was a young kid, my sister used to sleep in the room I sleep in now. In front of the door, there is a creek, so when you walk past, it makes a noticeable noise. I woke up at 2 a.m. and walked past the room to use the bathroom. The second I stepped foot on the creek, I heard a loud scream of horror. I ran into the room, yelling to turn on the light, genuinely freaked out myself, to find my sister totally scared shitless because she saw a ghost. My sister was 19 at the time. Fast forward about 10 years, and I now regularly see a ghost figure in my room and hallway. The ghost is an elderly white lady who wears a white scarf. She is peaceful and doesn't seem threatening. I see her about once every 2 months, but it still freaks me out every time I see her. The crazy thing is, before me and my sister really talked about what the ghost looked like, I explained the ghost's features to her, and she described the same exact person or thing. There was a local urban legend about a headless man who stalked the woods behind the apartment building I lived in when I was younger. My sister and 4 of our friends were walking along the ridge of the ravine to get to a path to go down to our fort we were building, and there was a small creek that ran through it. There was a sandbar we could see. I know this is going to sound absolutely insane, but all of us saw this. There was a hand that came out of the ground to about mid-forearm and drug itself across the sandbar for about 4 feet before slowly going back into the ground. We all ducking booked it. We moved about 6 months later but never went back to the area where we saw that. We all assumed it was the headless man coming up to try to get us. Remember this like it was yesterday. Was about 40 years ago. I was about 13 years old, and friends and I had been playing kick the can all night. I was probably 11 at night. Sitting on swings on the school playground just BSing. The school was 3 stories, and the top floor was double height, so the windows for the rooms were about 10 to 12 feet tall. All of a sudden we hear a whoomp, whoomp, kind of in the ether, from nowhere in particular. We all just dead stopped and gave each other blank looks, and then a few seconds later we heard a very loud rapping on one of the windows. We all looked up at the same time, and in one of the top floor windows was a whitish but opaque head and torso that was protruding out sideways about a foot or 2 from the top of the window. It was elongated and skull-like, almost kind of like the Scream head, but much more human-looking. We all just sat there paralyzed for what seemed like 2 minutes as it extended long, skinny, and seemingly non-jointed arms and kept rapping on the window, but as it was rapping, it was apparent the hands were coming literally through the window. It seemed like 2 minutes, but the whole thing was probably like 15 to 20 seconds. We hauled our asses out of there and didn't stop running till we got back to the friend's house we were sleeping at. We still talk about it to this day and can't even imagine what it was. It wasn't alien, it was ghost-like, but definitely seemed out of this world. I'm still crazy just thinking about it. A few years ago, I was about to leave a friend's house near a wooded area late at night. It was black outside, no shine from the moon. I had that creepy feeling people talk about, like they're being watched. I always thought that was something out of a cartoon. How do you feel being watched? But I did, and it was creepy. I kept looking around to see if there was someone or something around. I kept feeling it, but I saw nothing. Also, it was quiet out, like when people say too quiet to mean you don't hear any of the normal night noises for some reason, making it extra creepy. I decided to go back to my car and grab my mag light to shine around in the dark and see if there was anything, but I expected there to be nothing, right? Obviously, I was just being paranoid and stupid. I shined the light up my friend's driveway at the trees near the rear of the house, and 2 eyes shined back at me. I could make out the shape of a person, or something humanoid, and lots of shaggy hair on top. This person slowly backed further behind the tree while I shined the light on them. This lasted only a few seconds, but it scared the hell out of me. I hightailed it out of there after that. At the time, I told my friend maybe there was a werewolf outside the house, except I don't believe in werewolves. Bigfoot? I figured it was some weirdo spying on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was actually being stalked by some kind of animal, like I was being hunted. I say it's the creepiest thing because it felt super creepy at the time, and I'm still not sure who or what I saw. I told myself it was a person, but the way it moved seemed strange. This was also following an incident where my friend's brother had allegedly seen an alien of some kind in the same area, but what he saw had such a weird description that it just didn't fit anything normal, truly alien, speaking an alien language. 2 hours or so had passed since I went to bed to sleep. I used to share the room with my younger brother. This was back in 2001 or so, when I was 15 or 16 years old, but I don't remember why he wasn't sleeping there that night. I thought I was conscious because I could clearly see my room in the dark, as if I were awake. Suddenly, something grabbed one of my ankles and dragged me off from my bed. Then I started to float in a horizontal position. I know I was not conscious at that moment, but what I cannot explain is why I could see my room exactly as it was at that moment, bed and furniture in the same position. It was dark, and I could see the door's silhouette. I was still floating when I saw a gray alien with huge black eyes, with a bright, white light behind him or her. I've always liked to sleep with the door closed, but the alien had opened the door to get inside, and was trying to reach me with its hand in a very dramatic way, and telepathically told me come with me. One of my biggest fears at the time, not anymore, thanks to my skepticism, was aliens, especially that kind. I don't know why, but I tried to grasp its hand too. Out of nothing, still floating in that position, I got out of the room, floating from my room all the way through the hallway, like 16 feet, until I made it to my mother's room. After that, I found myself in bed. I freaked out and started to call my mother like crazy. I started to cry out of horror. She came in and got me a glass of water. I ended up sleeping next to her that night. I will never forget it. It was for sure sleep paralysis, but it was one of the worst episodes of that phenomenon that I have ever experienced. I'm not being a liar here, but after those episodes ended, I noticed it was often midnight or 5 minutes before midnight. I stopped having sleep paralysis after I turned 18. But it comes back every time I take prescription sleep medication. My brother and I both saw the same figure, and it freaked both of us out a lot at the time. When my little brother was a toddler, he'd babble about all sorts of things, most of which we, my dad and I, didn't really take too seriously. One time, however, he started talking about the broken grandpa he saw every night. At first, we thought he was talking about having dreams about his grandpa getting hurt or something, but after some investigation, that was ruled out. I spent a long time trying to figure out who or what the broken grandpa was, but to no avail. Eventually, it fell out of conversation as my brother moved on to more complex thoughts. Many years later, I was going to the bathroom late at night and saw a figure standing in the doorway, an older man, maybe 60 or so, from his shadow. I, being like 12, ran screaming to my parents and had to have my dad investigate the situation before I could even be near the bathroom, and even then, it freaked me out for a long time. Broken grandpa is mostly attached to the bedroom that used to be my brother's and then my grandma's. She sadly passed away a while ago. When I slept in there for a couple months, I'd have terrible nightmares and have to crash in other people's rooms to get a decent night's sleep. In any case, broken grandpa is scary as shit, and I never want to see him again. I used to live on a farm in Tennessee, growing up between the ages of 4 and 9. A classic ranch-style home with a big red barn behind it and a large fenced-in area with cows, and upon the closest neighbor was a good 30-minute drive or so. Getting to the mailbox was a hike in itself. Inside the barn was nothing but hay bales, and upstairs was a staircase I was forbidden to go up. Eventually, I got curious, as most young boys do, and decided to go up the forbidden stairs to see what was so bad about them. There wasn't much there but very old antique colons, old hides, and typical horse equipment, but everything was very dusty. But I was bored, so I started opening up cologne bottles and sniffing them to see what they smelled like and such, until from what felt like directly behind my neck came a cold breath and a loud man's voice yelling, "Get out!" I jumped up so fast and ran out of that barn, tripping over everything. I never spoke of what happened since I figured I would get into trouble for going up there. Every night after that, I would look out the window and see a man standing in the field, staring at me. One night the man was standing in the field as usual, but he was holding chains with very angry dogs on the other end, snarling and barking but making no sound. I throw the blankets over my head and fall asleep, scared. The next morning, the family dog was laying in the field, mauled to death. It wasn't until years later that I went back and told my cousins about what I had experienced during the years I had lived with them. They just stared at me like they had seen a ghost. They told me the upstairs of that barn was forbidden because the previous owner hung himself up there. I never knew anything else about said farmer, but it still gives me shivers thinking about it. My friends and I had a music gig in a small town in Indiana. These were the salad days of navigation devices, and ours was dead, so we relied on the good old Rand McNally. After a few minutes on the road, we realized two things: we're lost, and there's a power outage in the area. After driving a few more minutes, we see lights off in the distance and decide to follow them. Not in the sky like a UFO thing, but what you see when there's civilization nearby. We figured it's either the interstate or a town with power, so we can probably ask for directions. We are getting closer and closer and realize there's no town, and the light is flickering like that of a flame. We take a broad right turn, go over a river and into a forest preserve, and boom! A full-on KKK rally with the hoods and all. The drummer was half black. I'm not American. We made a quick 3-point turn and peeled off. Growing up, my family was very poor. We were an immigrant family, and my dad was struggling to make ends meet. I had a twin brother, so my mom stayed home to take care of us. Around the time I was 4 or 5, my dad moved us into this trailer so we could save money rather than living in an apartment. Anyway, my dad would be gone for months at a time, so it would just be my brother, my mom, and me. Since it was a 1-bedroom trailer that had poor heating, my mom would huddle all 3 of us together during the winter, and we would sleep in a tight bunch. The room was very small and had a closet just the right size to fit a full-size mattress in with the closet doors removed, so to save space, my mom stuffed the front end of the mattress in the closet, and we would sleep basically with our upper bodies and heads inside the closet. My dad comes home and is shocked that my mom had arranged the room this way. A week later, my mom is in hysterics, and we end up moving. My brother and I found out later in life that the reason why my dad got the trailer for so cheap is because a man committed suicide in that trailer. He hung himself in the closet. My dad was working at an elementary school in the summer, just cleaning and painting the place. I remember kids always talking about how it was haunted, and I guess there was a fire that killed someone or that a principal had killed himself there. A few years later, we drove by the school, and I asked my dad if he had ever seen anything there. He smiled and said, "Yeah, we never knew what it was." He told me a story about how they used to spray the windows with cleaners, and the mist would land in the shape of a person. They would just tell it to go away and would see it shift a bit, either running its hand through its hair or wiping its face, before it would dissipate and they would keep working like normal. He said he would hear weird clangs and bangs in the corners of rooms at times. The creepy part about all of this is that when he would tell it to be quiet, it would. He said that sometimes when he would mop, he would find bare footprints behind him. He went to the library and the local newspaper archives to see if he could find out something about the fire or the suicide, but never did. By far the weirdest thing that ever happened to me was in high school. Every so often, my group of friends and I would go up to this super dark park above this suburban tract of homes in LA County because you could see the stars super well. I had been up there hundreds of times with tons of different friend groups, with no issues or anything. It was a super peaceful park, and mind you, this park is bordered by 4 or 5 homes with their backyards running against some of it, so it's not deserted by any means. This night, I went with my girlfriend at the time, her sister, and my best friend. We're walking through the park to get to our usual spot, barely able to see a thing except for what is illuminated by the moon and the stars, when the stillness of the night is shattered by this intense rustling that erupts in some bushes about 20 yards from us. In my mind, in that moment, I immediately thought of and subsequently discarded 5 different explanations, and I was coming to the conclusion that it was either the devil or a space alien, when out pops a somewhat normal-looking guy, from what I could see in the dark. But I cannot explain it. This guy radiated a sense of utter wrongness. His appearance outwardly seemed normal, but my animal senses went into overdrive. So did my girlfriend and her sister, who immediately started backtracking with me, all except my dumbass friend, who decided to start moving towards this insane apparition. My girlfriend's sister starts hissing at my friend to come back to us, and mind you, this man is not moving, not shifting one iota from when he first popped out of the bushes. He just kept standing there, staring at us. Finally, my stupid friend gets within 5 yards of this guy and starts mocking him with funny noises when the guy finally speaks. What comes out is "get out," but it comes across in a garbled, almost devil-like tone. It absolutely seemed like a put-on, but at that time of night, in those circumstances, even my idiot friend wasn't questioning it. We backpedaled away, keeping our eyes on this guy the whole time. The creepiest thing? Once we were further away from where we saw him in the park, he turned around in one fluid motion and walked back into the bushes. We didn't visit that park again for a long time, but when we finally went back, we never saw him again. It was a summer camp up in the mountains that I worked at for a couple summers as a teen. Kids attending the camp would sometimes make up stories about seeing Bigfoot or a ghost out in the forest, typical dumb kid stuff. But there was one type of story in particular that I kept hearing from different groups over several months each summer, which had me a bit worried. The first time I heard of it was from one of the older camp employees recounting a story from many years prior. Apparently, his girlfriend at the time was unable to sleep in her cabin because she thought she was being watched by something outside her window. She said it was a very large, black crow that would just sit by the window and stare at her, but in a strangely menacing way. Even when the blinds were closed, she'd open them back up hours later, and it would still be there, staring. She would sometimes see it in the forest, even during the day, sitting between the trees, not making a sound, and glaring at her, its gaze following her as she walked. She said it was the same crow. She was certain. Its eyes felt human, according to her. Well, those stories came up every couple weeks like clockwork. Some kids would one day become distant and quiet, not wanting to leave their cabin for activities. Sometimes they'd ask to go home early. Most wouldn't say why. I think they knew no one would believe them. But occasionally, after prodding, they would admit that they were afraid of something they were seeing in the forest and around their cabin. All of these kids described pretty much the same thing. And it wasn't just kids, some of the other staff members claimed to have seen something similar as well. It was pretty easy to tell who was bullshitting and who wasn't. The ones who I think really did see something did not want to talk about it. They were very bothered by what they had been experiencing. They'd have awful nightmares, and they wouldn't want to be outside for long. I've seen plenty of crows up there, but they were just crows. They'd flap around, squawk, and spit, and that was it. I don't know why a crow would follow someone or stare at them for hours. That doesn't sound natural at all to me. I don't know what to make of it. It's such a silly story to hear the first time, but after hearing it again and again from people who have no way of knowing about it, you start to wonder. Especially after seeing how upset these people are. They didn't seem to be faking it for attention. It ruined their entire week. I was around 19 years old and had gone on a hiking and camping trip with two of my buddies in Central Oregon. Very remote type of place, taking hours of driving just to get to the trailhead. It was a 3-day backpacking excursion, or at least that is what we had intended. We were young and inexperienced, and we wound up getting lost on the second day. It took us 4 days to find our way out of the dense growth. Incidentally, we stumbled onto a deserted mining town by accident, which gave us our bearings. We rationed our provisions, so we were far from a dire predicament in those regards, and it was mid-August, so the elements did not impact us too adversely. So far, there's nothing creepy about any of it. But what happened on the 4th night of our trip is something that will not soon escape me. By this point, we were growing pretty concerned about our situation, as the entire day had been spent trying to find our way out of the woods. We had settled into camp for the night, weary and anxious. Our fire was dying out, so we threw in a few more hunks of wood and climbed into our tents in hopes of catching some much-needed sleep. I can't be sure who woke up first, but it was either me or one of my friends. I can't describe exactly what it was that woke us, but what we heard next was something that sounded like a telegraph or perhaps an old typewriter. It was faint, but with an unmistakably similar cadence of seemingly random clicks and taps. I poked my head out of my tent to find both of my friends' wide-eyed faces staring back. We were definitely all hearing it. Nobody said a word. The fire was but smoldering ashes, and the sky was overcast, so we couldn't see much beyond our tents. The sound was faint and hard to pinpoint, but it seemed to radiate from all around us. Distant yet immersive. None of us spoke, but in my mind I kept trying to rationalize the sound as being a squirrel or a woodpecker, anything. After some time, the noise faded, and the three of us continued to stare at one another, flabbergasted and quite obviously distraught. Before any of us had a chance to say anything, a new sound could be heard. This was distinctly more faint, but undeniably not a natural sound you'd hear in the middle of the woods, dozens of miles away from the closest town. What we heard, ISHTU not, was a noise that sounded like the transmissions you hear between NASA flight control and astronauts in outer space, overlaid with music that sounded like an orchestra. A high-pitched beeping sound, music, static, silence, unintelligible words being spoken by a male voice, more static, a high-pitched beep, silence, music, static. The beep had a resonating echo, and the static would go on for minutes at a time, broken by bouts of short silence. We were lost in it. The air was thick and damp, and I could feel the gravelly sound scraping against my senses. I recall my hand trembling as I looked down and realized I had not yet released my tent door zipper. The whole ordeal lasted maybe 30 minutes, but in a court of law, I'd swear it was hours. None of us slept the rest of the night. We wandered aimlessly around the next day, tired and dazed, growing increasingly terrified as darkness approached and we faced another night alone in the woods. Mercifully, this night proved uneventful, but I hardly slept a wink. The following day, fortune smiled upon us, and we stumbled onto the deserted mining town, allowing us to find our way out to civilization. Neither of us spoke of the incident after the trip. We never made any pacts or anything corny like that. We just ignored it. Oh, and before anybody asks, we weren't high, tripping, or anything like that. Hell, we hadn't even packed any alcohol. We didn't have any radios or electronics, save our watches and flashlights. We were completely isolated. I'm 28 now and have lost touch with my two buddies from that trip, though I found out recently that one of them was Kia in Iraq last year. I still have dreams about that night. I'm reluctant to call them nightmares because they aren't necessarily as horrifying as they are incredibly eerie, and it has been something that I've pushed into the depths of my subconscious as merely unexplainable. I am a normal person. I was in high school, maybe 16 to 17. I live with my parents in a rather large house. My dad is out of town on business, which was a common occurrence, and my mother always placed bells on all the door handles as part of her ritual when my father was gone. It was silly but set her mind at ease. We had a dog, no more than 25 to 30 pounds, great dog, terribly protective, which turned out to be good for times my dad was gone. Not much of a barker, so when she barked, you knew she meant business. I was awoken at exactly 3 a.m., my mother screamed and the dog started going apeshit. I ran out of my room, not sure what I was gonna do, but I was sure there must be an intruder. Was running towards her room. Her bedroom door was open, typical. She wouldn't close it so she could hear the bells on the doors. Between me and her doorway was the stairs leading downstairs. She screamed at me to stop. I did. I didn't see anyone, but the dog was obviously after something that we couldn't see. She was chasing whatever she saw around my mom's bed. She was growling and barking the way a dog would if it was fighting something, teeth bared, snarling, spitting and snapping at something she saw. It was terrifying. I'd never seen her act like that before. I stood there frozen when all in a split second I felt all the hair on my body stand on end. I could almost taste an electricity in the air, and it literally felt like someone had opened a freezer door right in front of me. A slight breeze went past me and my dog flew down the stairs. My mother and I followed, flipping on lights as we went. The dog, still snarling and snapping at something, appeared to chase it all over the house, cornering it, up onto couches, behind couches, under tables. It was terrifying. All the lights were on at this point and we could not see what the dog was chasing. Finally the dog chased it down another hallway. Bells on doors were jingling. The doors were all shut, hence the setting of the bells in the first place. You'd hear it when the door handle would move. At this point I'm almost pissing my pants. My mom runs to the front door, opens it up, and out the dog comes running, snapping at the heels of this invisible thing all the way out to the driveway, where she stops barking, paces back and forth a couple of times and casually trots back inside. My mom later tells me she had a dream just before this happened. She was in the house and was greeted by a cat. We have never owned a cat. When she reached out to pet it, its face contorted and turned into a demon face. My mother was still as rather religious, often attributes strange things happening as demons. It was at that point she woke up to the feeling of an animal on the bed. The dog had started growling at this point, from the foot of the bed. The dog was never allowed on the bed. My mom said she turned her light on to see the bedspread move as if something was in the process of jumping off, and that would be the time when the dog saw whatever we couldn't and started chasing it.